Looks like the streaming is on. Okay, thank you. Welcome everyone to the meeting. Can I just advise that the meeting will be live streamed for public viewing and will be uploaded after the meeting together with the decision sheet showing decisions taken during the meeting. The press and public will be asked to leave the proceedings after the public business if there is a requirement to consider the exempt appendices. Can I ask Andrew to read the protocol? Or
thank you, Chair.
Must do that.
Just a reminder, only to speak when invited to by the Chair. If you wish to speak, please raise your hand and direct all communications via the Chair. Please ensure that your mics are muted when you are not speaking. If you're referring to a specific page or picture in the report, refer to it by the page number. If you are having technical difficulties, please use the chat function in Google Meet to alert the meeting, or dial in on your phone number using the number provided in the invite. Please do not use the chat function for putting formal questions to the committee or to make any other comments. Any persistent disruptive behaviour will result in removal from the meeting. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I've had apologies from Deputy Mayor Bramble and Councillor Kennedy, although Councillor Kennedy is present at the meeting or in attendance virtually. Yeah. So welcome, Councillor Kennedy. Sorry you couldn't be here. Just to say, I can't see electronic hands here, but I presume Andrew will draw my attention if anyone wants to speak. Yeah? Okay. We have no items of urgent business. Can I ask if any members have interest to declare? Haven't been done already. So I take that as none. If I can move no notice to conduct business in private, no questions or deputations. Can we look at the unrestricted minutes of the previous meeting on 17th of January 22? Can we agree those as a true record? Agreed, thank you. Which brings us to item 7, appointment of Dockless Bike Share Scheme operator in Hackney, which is partly exempt. So someone, if you let me know at the appropriate point for that. Can I ask, I think it's Tobias Newland to introduce the report and to respond to any queries.
Thank you very much, Chair. I'm attending in place of Tobias Newland. My name is Tyler Linton. I'm the Group Manager for Sustainable Transport within Street Scene. I'd like to present this report for approval to appoint one operator to operate a publicly available cycle hire service in the borough on a concessionaire arrangement for the council. It addresses the need to provide cycle hire options in the borough that in the areas which are not provided for by the TfL cycle hire scheme, and it meets the council's objective to increase and encourage cycling in the borough. Procurement is consistent with the council's overall approach to public bicycle hire, including constraining and regulating the locations for where the cycle hires will be available. 3 previous decisions, 2 at the cabinet level or above, including a full council agreement in October 2019, which supported a borough-wide bylaw being developed by London councils, and a cabinet decision in June 2020 to implement a council-specific enforcement policy means that operators are now required to only leave their bikes within designated bays in the borough, an exercise the council's undertaken over the past 2 years and now has identified and installed a number of dedicated bays, meaning that through this contract, our operator would need to ensure that their bikes are only left in those dedicated bays. The supplier was selected from a competitive process. We published an invitation for proposals on the Pro Contract portal with 7 bids received, and further details in the report around 5 incomplete bids and 2 bids that were scored. We're recommending one of those suppliers who scored highest on quality and price. Officers recommend that the committee approve bidder D to operate a cycle hire scheme of the borough for an initial period of 2 years with up to 2 further annual extensions. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Are there questions or comments from members? Councillor Woodley.
Thank you, Tyler. Yeah, very much welcome that the bikes can only be left in designated bays, and I did note that the e-bikes that were left astray would have to be collected, I think, within an hour, which seemed great. I have a question, I suppose, around the alternative options. I suppose it's really around our longer term objectives with a scheme like this. If we don't want to operate a council owned and run scheme or to operate a scheme in partnership, are we seeing this as something that will not grow? We've obviously seen these kind of schemes across the city for a while now. And I'm wondering, yeah, does evidence suggest it makes sense to aim long term to provide a service that allows people to just use e-bikes? Use e-bikes occasionally on the rare occasions that they're needed, so visitors to the borough or across the borough, or where they have no space, I suppose, to secure one at home? Or do we see this as a stepping stone to e-bike ownership and therefore not a long-term arrangement? What does the evidence show? Do users go on to buy? Are there regular patterns of use? What narrative will the company and the council use in promoting the service, and will the company support cycle training for users? And I'm thinking of all users here, so that it's a truly inclusive scheme.
Officer want to respond, please.
Thank you. Yes, I'll try and take those points in turn. I think one of your points really is the nugget of that, and that is, do users go on to buy e-bikes? We're operating under the assumption that it isn't necessarily a stepping stone to owning e-bikes in the borough. Evidence is anecdotal at best, but anecdotal evidence does suggest that people who try them do end up using them more and more. But it's not a particular council priority to promote e-bikes over pedal bicycles. So this is being promoted as a scheme that provides a service for occasional use for short journeys, although there's some interesting sort of academic questions around what length of journey do we want to target, because of course very shorter journeys are probably being made by walking, and we don't necessarily want to switch people from walking. But it's very much a service that's being provided rather than a stepping stone towards people owning bikes. And I think you've provided a few examples of where it's useful, this sort of occasional use, maybe a one-way use. A lot of people who own bikes also make use of these services. They're useful to getting to stations, useful for one-way journeys. One of the sort of long-term challenges is that the marketplace has been fairly volatile. We started seeing bicycles turning up in London 4 or 5 years ago, and since then companies have come and gone. We've had previous contracts with 2 companies, one which was subject to a global merger, and another one which withdrew from London due to the operating conditions and sort of financial viability. So it's a competitive marketplace where end users have good options across London, and as a tenderer we had good options to look at, but it's still very much finding its feet in terms of being a stable marketplace with companies and who are likely to be here. We don't know what the picture is going to be like, and it would be a big risk for the council to step into that marketplace. But what is clear is that there's demand from residents. We know that residents want this service, and that it can provide a useful bridge, a useful service, what they call it mobility as a service, for certain types of journeys, and that does fit with the council's priorities. I do apologize if I missed part of your question, but feel free.
I think it was looking at the number, really. If we were looking at circa 300 bikes, and wondering if you saw that as a stable number, because obviously there's only so many spaces that we can create to hold those bikes. And I suppose really the narrative that will accompany this, it was sort of popular with some and not with others, and that came down to the way they were used. So I'm wondering whether the company will support training, will support a narrative that's around how they're used, by whom. Yeah, that sort of wider context, really. But really, I'm asking all of those questions with a view to whether or not this is something we'll want to take on ourselves in future if we deem them to be successful. And to understand if they're successful, I need to know what we're hoping to achieve.
Thank you. Yes, sorry, I did miss that. So the question of why 300, that was an officer-led estimate to what an appropriate level of bikes would be to achieve coverage across the borough. So we want these to be available geographically across the wider area, and we know roughly what sort of density is required to make that viable for the company and to provide a good level of service for residents. There needs to be a natural churn of the bikes so that they're available and reliable. So the sort of 300 number comes sort of strictly from a geographical estimate. We have 15 different indicators that we're going to be asking the company to report to us every month. So we will have a picture of who's using them, what the average length of journey is, what the average fare people are paying, and we will be feeding that information into an independent study that we're asking the operator to fund during the life of this contract, to answer some of your questions. Because to be completely honest, some of your questions, we have experience with the council doing this, and it has come to a situation where the previous operators are no longer operating. So there is still fairly new ground for us, and we don't quite know all the answers to the questions. But in terms of training, yes, there will absolutely be a recommendation to support training. In fact, the operator, as part of the contract, will be making a voluntary contribution towards general cycling promotion in the borough, which will go towards things like cycle training. The narrative around the scheme will be that the council is enabling a well-regulated cycle hire scheme in the borough to increase the number of options that residents have for getting around the borough sustainably, while also balancing. So that we call them dockless bikes, but actually the model that we're promoting isn't dockless. It's strictly dockless because the bikes don't plug into a dock like the TfL dock, but they're coming back to a fixed location, to a base each time. So that is part of the strict regulatory position we're taking, and the narrative will be we're balancing flexibility of this sort of new technology, this mobility as a service technology, against a sort of firmer degree of regulation to ensure that we're getting a service for residents without creating new obstructions on the pavement.
Final comment, Chair, then thank you, because I only saw 3, you understandably pulled out the main KPIs in 11.4. And I was, as I said, very pleased to see that there was a sort of a time limit on recovering bikes that didn't make it into those bays, and also for taking unsafe bikes off. But with the net uptake in cycling, there wasn't, there's just a 0 figure there, which is why I was kind of very curious about our expectations. If I could request, Chair, that we see those 15 indicators just in the minutes. I won't ask Tyler to go through them now. I think that just might be quite interesting for us to get a sense of whether it succeeds in due course. Otherwise, very much support the paper. Thank you.
Councillor Kennedy.
Thank you. Yes, I think this is a good paper. I support it. I would like to know what conversations we've had with neighbouring boroughs, please. Because presumably if there's operation in a neighbouring borough, it would be possible to go across boundaries, and I wonder what that adds or takes away. Do you run the risk of bikes, there not being enough bikes, and them having to expend more energy and more resource moving them back? I haven't seen, apologies if I've missed it, the number of corrals that there are, so the number of different locations. And then I wondered if we were somewhere in those indicators capturing work that this contract might create elsewhere in the organisation. So you're taking account of the 0.1 full-time equivalent in the transport and engagement team and the design and engineering team. But if bikes keep getting left in a location and complaints keep getting made, you end up with members' services and probably somebody else in street team or in housing ending up responding to complaints and possibly actually physically having to go out to locations. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, I'll take those in order. We are having conversations with our neighboring boroughs who historically have taken a slightly different approach to ourselves. And there is a longer term goal for coordination across the boroughs. It's something that TfL and London councils have been trying to achieve on a London level. And it's something that we've supported. That brings about several challenges, and I think we need to think about coordinating on a smaller than London level, with not withdrawing our support for a London-wide approach. That's part of the reason for a shorter contract, so that the council's in a position to be a little bit agile with what's happening on a London-wide basis in the next five years or so. The operator that we're recommending, one of the technical and professional requirements was to have operated a scheme in general, but in particular that it wasn't a criteria in the procurement, but it did mean that we were getting submissions from companies that have operations elsewhere in London. So we are recommending a supplier who is already operating in London, and that will mean that their current zone is expanded rather than Hackney being an island. One of our neighbours to the south has a policy essentially to make a contract with any operator who's operating in one of their neighbours. There's one of our other neighbours has a policy not to enter into any contract. So there's a diversity of positions with our neighbours, and that could change over time. But to put it more plainly, we're recommending a supplier that would have cross-boundary zone, but not across London and not across the sort of region. We have 64 corrals in place at the moment, and we'd be looking to expand those alongside the operator. We'd be providing contribution towards that. We would be looking to expand it by about 50% each year, so another 30 corrals each year. We think about 120 corrals is right, but we don't want to expand them in advance of demand. We want to expand alongside demand. Again, that goes to the sort of the churn that's necessary for the bikes. The bikes need to be used and be seen out on the streets for people to use them more and to sort of justify the further expansion of the corrals. Work created elsewhere in the council, that's a very good point, and it's something that we've had conversations, especially in advance of bringing the enforcement policy to Cabinet in 2020. I've had conversations with the environmental enforcement team and waste services who would be involved in enforcing against bikes left outside of the corrals. Within the contract, within the enforcement policy, we've set a fixed penalty notice for any operator who's left their bikes outside of the corrals. And through the contract, the recommended supplier has agreed in principle to that charge fee as well. So while there may be some additional work, first of all, if there is additional work, something's not working, and we need to pick that up through the KPIs, because the operator needs to be responsible. They need to be doing the work to make sure those bikes get back in the corrals within an hour. If we start seeing an increase of work, we'll need to take sort of contractual action. But in that in between, where there may be one or two bikes, we will be reclaiming our costs and making sure that gets back to the right part of the council. Thank you. Okay,
Councillor Kennedy. Okay, thank you. I had a couple of questions. One, I think you might have partially covered, and without going too much into technology, is there any risk of these becoming a nuisance if they're left in inappropriate places, or is there have you got some procedure in place to cover that risk?
That's right. There's a risk of them being left in the wrong place. But like I said, we've got a KPI with we would have a contractual KPI with the operator to address any bike within a set amount of time. And if they fail, there's a recharge of £80, for instance. And there is a technical solution, and that's that they have agreed to, in their app, users won't be able to either leave, end a journey, or hire a bike outside of those locations. So if a bike gets left inappropriately, the company will have to come and move it before someone's able to hire it again. And that is a significant disincentive for them to be allowing that to happen.
Yeah, thank you. That's helpful. The other question, referring to the appendix without going into any of the detail in the appendix, we talk about tendered voluntary contribution. When you're talking in contractual terms, the word voluntary sort of is unusual. What does that mean? Does it mean we should expect that, or
Yeah,
it's not the word I normally. It's not the word I normally expect to see in a contract, if you know what I mean.
Yes, that language differentiated in the procurement process from fees that we were setting for all bidders. So there was a certain baseline of costs that we were expecting all bidders to agree to, sort of pass fail. Voluntary meant voluntary at the procurement stage, so that it was voluntary for them to propose a fee. But having proposed a contribution, they'll be required to pay it on the anniversary of the contract. It's not voluntary once we enter into a contract with them. It'll be contractual.
Okay, that's comforting. Thank you. Are there any more questions from members? Can we then move to agree the recommendations as set out in the report to accept the award contract, and thank the officers very much for their time and work on that. Agreed. Okay, so right, the next thing we've got a briefing note on the procurement parks and green spaces concession opportunities. I think Ian Holland is going to say a few words in introduction.
Councillor Chair, and Sam Parry will be.
Okay, thank you, Sam.
Thank you, Chair. In 2021, Hackney adopted its new Parks and Green Spaces strategy, which included a commitment to expand the provision of affordable and healthy food and drink in parks and green spaces. This was in response to a large number of people in Hackney stating that they value the ability to buy food and drink when they use our facilities. We already have cafes in Clissold and Springfield Park, and last year we opened a brand new cafe in Shoreditch Park as part of the Britannia Leisure Centre. We are now keen to extend this provision to some of our smaller parks, many of which currently have no food or drink provision nearby. Having food and drink can encourage people to spend more time in our parks, as well as attracting a new audience to a space. Such kiosks and cafes not only provide a valuable service to park users, they also represent a business and employment opportunity for local people and can help contribute financially to the running of our parks and green spaces. Smaller kiosks could potentially also offer the opportunity to a small business to operate their own premises for the first time. They also offer a physical presence in our parks to help make them feel safer for our users. The paper that you've got in front of you outlines 8 potential permanent locations for kiosk concessions and 15 potential temporary locations. Each concession will be advertised to local businesses, and successful operators will be chosen via a tendering process. As the paper outlines, a key part of the tendering process will ensure that any operator is a right fit for the park, with waste minimisation, local sourcing of food, carbon reduction and other sustainability factors a key part of the scoring criteria. We think that these kiosks will be a welcome addition to our parks and an attractive opportunity for local businesses. We welcome any questions you may have on the proposal.
Thank you very, very much. Are there any questions or comments from members? Councillor Woodley?
Perhaps a comment rather than a question. Obviously, as Cabinet Member for Parks and Green Spaces, I'm sort of following this work with interest, and whilst it sits below, I guess, the requirement really to come to the Cabinet Procurement and Insourcing Committee, there are protocols, I guess, attached around procuring green, procuring for a better society, procuring fair delivery. And whilst these are very small concessions, together they kind of tell a story, I suppose, about what we're offering in Hackney and whether we're staying true to those values and considering equalities, and very happy to sort of see it stated plainly that kiosk operators will not be permitted to use single-use plastic. They'll be encouraging reusable and biodegradable packaging, essentially working with our park user groups, I guess, to kind of find the right fit in our parks and green spaces. So really just to thank you for bringing this note, and looking forward to sort of seeing how this develops.
Thank you. And then more hands.
Sorry, Councillor Kennedy.
Councillor Kennedy.
Thank you. Yes, and thanks for the advanced conversations that we have had about this. I'm excited to see the prospect of markets and market type operations in Abney Park and Clissold Park and Haggerston Park. But I wanted to build on what Councillor Woodley has just said, and check that all operators there would also be looking at their sustainability, them not using, for example, single-use plastics, and looking across the piece so that we weren't ending up encouraging non-sustainable practice. That we're vetting everyone who turns up, or writing a good contract for everyone who turns up.
Absolutely, yeah, that will be a key part of the criteria. It's worth also mentioning that says we will eliminate single-use plastic from all of our cafe and catering operators. So that commitment is there. Yeah.
I think we got that, yeah. Sorry, you cut out a bit there, Mr. Parry, but I think we got it. Any other questions or comments? Yeah, can I again, yeah, thank you very much for presenting the note. We have had some discussions outside the committee on this issue, and I think it's a really good opportunity to bring unused facilities into use, make some money for the council, and pursue a number of our sustainable procurement objectives. So we offer you our best wishes with it, and thank you for the note. I guess we just have to note this formally, do we? If we can note it, yeah, noted. Okay, so thank you very much. There are no other items of urgent business, and just remains for me to say that the next meeting will be on the 7th of March, followed by one on the 11th of April. Thank you all very much.